Hello again, class. Today we're going to continue our series of introductory lessons on government. Today we're going to talk about some theories about where governments originally came from, and then talk about a few different types of government. Before we do that, however, let's go over some key terms that we're going to be using, not just in this lecture, but throughout our class. All right, so what's the difference between a nation and a state and a country? My guess is your answer is that a nation and a country are the same thing, and a state is just a smaller unit of a country. That's not actually true. All right, so let's start with nation. Nation is a group of people united by a common race, language, or custom or traditions, or religion. All right, so it's a group of people who basically have a very similar background, ethnicity, that type of things. A state, on the other hand, is any community occupying a defined territory with an actual government. Okay. So a state is any group of people who own a specific territory with an actual government. Now let's look at the definition for country. Country, also a community occupying a defined territory with an actual government. Okay, so that's right. A state and a country, those words essentially mean the same thing. All right, now here in America, we don't think of them that way because we think of the 50 states as being part of, the United States as a whole, which is our country. And that's very true. But that's because when the founding fathers created the Constitution, they created the country and came up with that name, United States, they were describing what they were doing. They were taking these 13 original states who in effect were the same as countries and combining them into a larger country. So they call them the United States. They're uniting these different states, or almost like in effect uniting 13 different countries into a great big country. And now we obviously have 50 states, but it's still one giant country. All right. So a state and a country, in the very traditional specific definition of the meaning of those words, mean essentially the same thing. Whereas a nation's a little different. A nation's a group of people who are united by something they have in common. Okay. So for instance, you have certain groups in the world that we refer to as a stateless nation. They're a nation, all right, they're a group of people united by race, language, tradition, religion, that sort of thing, but they don't have any particular territory with an actual government. All right, perhaps the most well-known stateless nation at this time period are a group of people called the Kurds, Kurds. All right, and those are a group of people who are spread out among several different countries, namely Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And they're spread out among these four other countries, but the Kurds don't have a country or a state of their own. So we refer to them as a stateless nation. All right, they are a group of people who are united by race and language and such, but they don't have a country or a specific territory, a state, to call their own. The fourth term I want to talk about is sovereignty. A sovereignty is a country that governs and rules itself without control from another country or state. So it's another way of saying independent. All right. So think back to your old history classes when you learned about colonial times. I don't know if you're studying them in world history this year, but you probably studied them back in your 8th grade U.S. history class when America was a colony of Britain. All right, a colony isn't necessarily a sovereign because it doesn't control itself. A sovereign is a country that governs and rules itself without control from another country or state. So in that respect, the United States is a sovereign. All right, it's a sovereign country. It's a sovereign state. It's a country that governs itself. All right, so those are key terms. So I'm going to try my best to always use these terms as with the formal definition that we've discussed here. But sometimes just know when we're talking about the United States and we're talking about, the individual states, I'm probably going to be talking about the state, like this, I say the state of Texas. While it's true, Texas in some sense is a sovereign state. It has certain rules and rights under the idea of federalism that we'll learn about this year that makes it a sovereign. But it's also somewhat controlled or part of a greater country, namely the United States. Okay, so, when I'm using these words in a particular sense, I'll try to tell you how I'm using them. Otherwise, I'll try to use them in the most exact informal definition of the words. Right. So, where do you think states and governments came from? And I'll tell you, no one knows for sure because governments have been around for so long, longer than we really have written history. But there are various theories, and we're going to discuss some. And, my guess is that depending on the time period or the region, some of these theories may have been true in some places, but not others. So, all right, one theory you need to know about is the evolutionary theory. Okay. This is the theory that states that governments essentially evolved from families, okay, and that once extended families became large enough that they couldn't be ruled by one person, a government had to be created. All right, for instance, think back to a caveman, and you have a single family. All right, it's pretty clear that the parents are in charge of that family. But then they get a little bit older, and their kids have kids, and now maybe it's the grandparents in charge. But fast forward, the grandkids have grandkids, and then those grandkids have grandkids, et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden now this quote-unquote family, is a few hundred people. Well, great-great-grandpa and grandma can't necessarily rule or organize that many people. All right, so a government essentially sort of develops from this head of the family type situation. All right, so that's one theory. Another theory, and this has certainly been true in certain places at certain times, is the force theory. That's simply that the strongest leader or the strongest group, through violence and force, took over the group. All right, there's a saying that might makes right. All right, so think, someone who's mighty is real strong. All right, so someone with a lot of might. Well, whatever they say is in effect right, so to speak, because who's going to disagree with them? You might get hurt if you disagree with them. So that's sort of what this theory is about. That somebody or somebodies who were strong enough to basically kill and or threaten enough people that they could take control of a group. All right, so that's the force theory. The third theory we're going to talk about is the divine right theory. This is the theory that leaders are chosen by a god. Maybe they're even a descendant of a god. Okay? I believe, and I'm not saying this with 100% certainty, but I believe that was the theory for the Aztecs. I think the Aztecs believed the rulers were some form of a god. Also, I believe the pharaohs in Egypt believed themselves to be divine, and that they were basically God. But this idea that leaders are chosen by God, that is continued throughout the world into very modern times. I mean, even into the 17 and 1800s, kings in Europe were arguing that they had the divine right to rule, that they had been chosen by God to lead a country. And even today, in a place like possibly Iran, this theory may still be being used to justify power. All right, the fourth theory we're going to talk about is the social contract theory. And this is the theory that there exists some type of contract between the people and the government. If you haven't already, in your world history class, you will eventually learn about the time period called the Enlightenment, the scientific and philosophy movement that came about after the Middle Ages. And the social contract theory develops a lot during the Enlightenment. But as you can see, different people and different philosophers had different ideas as to what the social contract was. All right. Thomas Hobbes, he opined that, and that just means to give an opinion, to give a theory. He believed that people had basically gave up some of their freedoms in exchange for safety and protection. Okay? Which, I mean, it does make sense. Think about driving a car. We give up our right to drive our car 120 miles an hour. We give up our right to run red lights when we drive a car because we don't want everyone else around us running red lights at 120 miles an hour because that would be dangerous for us. Okay? And so this was Thomas Hobbes' idea, that people give up some of their freedoms in exchange for safety and protection. John Locke talked about it, the social contract being in terms of people just giving the government certain powers that are needed to protect people's rights. Right? In other words, people will give the government the right to create an army and a navy and an air force so that the military can protect us from foreign countries. Right, that's John Locke's theory. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, talked about in terms of the fact that laws are only binding on people if the people agreed to those laws. Now, that's not a real strict definition. And so, in other words, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have to follow any law that you don't like or agree to, but you have to have a say in passing it. Okay. Whether or not you agree with the law that says you can't go around robbing banks, it doesn't matter. You still have to agree to it because we as citizens voted on the people who make our laws, and they wrote laws that said don't go rob banks. Okay, so when you understand Rousseau's theory, don't take it 100% literally that people don't have to follow whatever laws that they don't like. Just understand that what he's really saying is people have to have a hand in making the laws. And as long as they have a hand in making laws, then at that point they have to follow them. All right, let's talk about types of government. And let's go back to the ancient Greece. All right, I know by now, if you've taken your world history class, you've learned about ancient Greece and Aristotle and those philosophers. So let's look at Aristotle's idea of government. Because he put government into 6 categories, 3 good and 3 bad. And as you see on the chart on the right, they basically go up based on how many rulers you have. All right, so monarchy. All right, that's a one ruler system where you have one ruler, like a king or a queen, who rules in the best interest of the country. Now, Aristotle said, okay, this would be an ideal form of government. If you had a monarch, and assuming that this monarch was very intelligent, very fair, very honest, one of the best for his country, that would be a really good form of government. Because, basically putting the smartest person in charge, the smartest, most honest person in charge would lead to good results. This would be the theory why monarchy would be good. However, Aristotle said, but if you put one person in charge, this can deviate into corruption, into tyranny. The corrupt form of a monarchy is a tyranny. This is a rule by a single person who rules badly and basically in his or her own interest without caring about the rights of the people. Okay? So, again, Aristotle is basically holding up sort of a mirror to each of these theories. One's good and one's bad. All right? And so he says, look, if you have a really smart monarch who cares about the people, that's a correct form of government. However, if you give people too much power, they essentially sort of start looking out for themselves eventually. And so they would turn into a tyranny. All right. So now, what do we call it when a few people are ruling? Well, if it's an ideal situation, and a few people who rule the country in the best interest of the country, we call that an aristocracy. An aristocracy. On the other hand, if you put just a few people in charge, they may simply start looking out for their own interest. They may get together and say, "Hey, there's only 4 of us in charge. Let's just sort of help ourselves, and all those other people will, have to basically do what we say and, provide us with all the wealth and power the country has to offer." All right, we call that an oligarchy. All right, so again, it's the same system in effect where you have just a few rulers in charge, but the good version of it is called an aristocracy, at least according to Aristotle. The bad version is called an oligarchy. And then finally, if you have many rulers is called a democracy. That's the rule by people through voting, but you do have rules in place, and it typically is in the interest of everyone. The opposite form of a monarchy, the bad form of a democracy, excuse me, I said monarchy, but I meant democracy. The bad form of a democracy is a mob rule or anarchy. Okay? This is sort of basically where no one's in control. There are so many people in control that in effect no one is in control. Now, one way to view this mob rule is by it's a majority of people who aren't bound by rules and who only care about the interest of those in the majority. All right, so they don't protect minority rights in effect. All right. So this is bad one. If you're part of this, or if you're not part of the 51% majority, no one may be looking out for your interest. The other thing that can happen in a mob rule or anarchy is simply no one's in charge, and everybody's just kind of doing whatever they want. So earlier I talked about the idea of we give up our freedom to drive 120 miles an hour, or give up our freedom to run red lights so we can be safe. Under an anarchy, there may not even be red lights in place at all. It would just be a free-for-all. And so that is the version of the bad version of democracy. Okay. So Aristotle put out these various forms of various types of governments to explain, kind of the good and bad forms depending on the number of rulers. Right. So this has been somewhat of a shortish lecture, but we're going to stop now. Next time we'll talk about basically types of governments that actually exist in the world today. Aristotle was talking about more in theoretical terms. We're going to look at how these types of governments are put into effect here in more recent times. But before then, or before we go to that next lecture, start thinking about this. Out of these 6, which form of government would you recommend? And if you know, which did Aristotle recommend? All right, think about those questions in advance of our next lesson.